Welcome to Next Gen Mentoring Forum. Next Gen Mentoring Forum series is to empower, educate, and illuminate individuals who are in or interested in the financial planning profession. At each forum, an expert will discuss a topic in the field of financial planning with the purpose of inspiring critical thoughts and discussions. In today's session, we are very honored to have Dr. Pfau with us today. He is going to talk about navigate important financial decisions for retirement. My name is Dr. Chia-Li. I am an assistant professor and director of financial planning program at California Lutheran University. I am a certified financial planner practitioner and maintain an active financial planning practice specializing in succession program management at Value Growth Institute. I'm so very honored today to have Dr. Pfau with us today. Dr. Pfau is the program director of the Retirement Income Certified Professional Designation and a professor of retirement income at the American College of Financial Services in King of Prussia in Pennsylvania, as well as a co-director of the college's Center for Retirement Income. He is a principal and director for McLean Assets Management. He holds a doctorate in economics from Princeton University and has published more than 60 peer-reviewed research articles in the wide variety of academic and practitioner journals. He hosts the Retirement Researcher website and is a contributor to Forbes, Advisor Perspectives, Journal of Financial Planning, and an expert panelist for the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Pfau's the newest book is the Retirement Planning Guidebook, Navigating the Important Decisions for Retirement Success. Plus, the third edition of Reverse Mortgage is coming out on March 1st. I have my reading list all lined up. Dr. Pfau also was my dissertation committee chair. So thank you, Dr. Pfau, for coming in today. I really do appreciate you taking time. I know you're very, very busy. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing on my end and let you take over the slides. And as we go through the presentation, we will probably have a few minutes toward the end of the presentation for Q&A. So Dr. Pfau?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Chien. And I thought you were going to skip the most important part of my bio there, but you did get it in right at the end, being your dissertation supervisor. It was a
right.
Wonderful experience. But you got it in there. And so thanks everyone for joining this afternoon and for the opportunity to talk about, I guess I don't have the right title on this slide, but it all fits together, navigating important decisions for retirement. And in particular, to provide some context, this is based on some research I did with Alex Margia during the pandemic. And then it really became, as I was writing this retirement planning guidebook, step one. So to provide more context there, like these are the 12 steps I view as an important part of building a complete retirement income plan. And so step one is just identifying your retirement income style. And that's what I'll focus on today. That is really, it's based on new research, and it's how I view step one of retirement planning. And that gives a sense of how much effort do you want to pay attention to things like the investment strategy, annuities, and so forth to lay a foundation and a starting point. And then beyond that as well, recognizing and understanding what the risks for retirement are and how they impact an individual's financial plan. And then looking at the finances. So what are the financial goals for retirement, and assessing preparedness through something like the funded ratio or some other financial planning software to assess how much assets are there to fund retirement expenses. What are those retirement expenses? What is the budget? What are the legacy goals? What are the reserves to manage the unexpected that someone wants to have? And then are there sufficient assets to cover that? Step 4 gets into, okay, how do we build a specific retirement income strategy, which that conversation starts with the step 1, what is your retirement style? But then in building the retirement strategy, looking at different annuity tools, different investment tools, and so forth, and trying to settle on a basic approach to funding retirement. Then as well, these next steps are important decisions that can't be overlooked. The Social Security claiming decision, decisions around, well, healthcare, pre-Medicare, plus then Medicare decisions throughout retirement. Having some sort of plan in place for long-term care, whether that's to self-fund, to use a long-term care insurance policy, either traditional or one of the more hybrid approaches that combines long-term care with life insurance or an annuity, or Medicaid planning and that sort of thing. Then we have retirement housing decisions, and that can also then lead into, with those who have an eligible home, whether a reverse mortgage might be part of the planning process. Tax planning, and this is another area where I've been doing a lot of research most recently, of actually getting into the mechanics of how do you develop a strategic Roth conversion strategy to extend portfolio longevity and or to have more legacy after meeting a retirement goal. Then you've got the legacy and incapacity planning, the non-financial aspects of retirement, which really are just as important as the financial considerations. And that's really about managing time. What are you going to do in retirement? What's your purpose? What's your passion? How are you going to replace work? Some people really struggle with that. So maybe work has a role in retirement, or maybe volunteer work or hobbies, but trying to help people facilitate that transition from spending 8 hours a day working or whatever the case may be for them to filling that time with something else. And then the final 12th step is implementing the retirement plan, as well as making ongoing monitoring and adjustments as one goes throughout retirement. So now digging really into the retirement income styles in particular. So what are some of the issues with investing for retirement? And then I'll talk a bit about risk tolerance questionnaires and how they don't necessarily align well with the concerns or preferences people have for retirement. I'll talk more about retirement income concerns and beliefs, and then putting that all together to talk about retirement styles and how those styles then match to specific retirement strategies. So a key emphasis is retirement is different. The pre-retirement accumulation world that a lot of times just gets extrapolated and used in the same manner post-retirement, it doesn't necessarily meet the new differences that retirees face. And that's in particular with the risks they face, with the longevity, with the market volatility, and how the sequence of returns risk amplifies that. And then also the different types of spending shocks. So retirement is different. Post-retirement is different from pre-retirement. This analogy of mountain climbing, I think, is really effective to explain the idea where if you're climbing a mountain, it's typical to think, well, my goal is to make it to the top of the mountain. But the reality is you need to make it safely back down the mountain as well. And getting down the mountain is much more complicated than getting to the top of the mountain. That's where most of the accidents happen. It's on the way down as people are tired or they slip. And it's easier to go up, not easier, strenuous, but it's not as dangerous going uphill as it is going downhill. And that same sort of analogy applies for retirement, where we often think, and there's even been financial service companies that have run commercials where people are walking around with a number over their head. And it's like the goal of retirement planning is to achieve some sort of wealth accumulation target, whatever that number may be. If it's 1 million or 2 million or 500,000, it's kind of framed as, if I save enough, then I've achieved my retirement goal. And that's like getting to the top of the mountain. But getting back down that mountain in the context of retirement is, now I have to sustain that number, that investment portfolio or that wealth allocation throughout an unknown time horizon and in the face of all these new retirement risks. And so that process is more dangerous. Getting down the mountain, making it through retirement sustainably is more difficult than saving and accumulating and getting to the top of the mountain. Now, with retirement strategies, though, there hasn't been, there's a lot of debates and a lot of disagreements, and you can see this all the time, especially if you visit some internet discussion boards and so forth. People don't agree on the best framework for how to approach retirement. And so a big part of what this research was trying to say is, for a long time, I felt different strategies are all viable. But then how do you figure out this person should use a systematic withdrawal strategy with investments, or that person should use an annuity as part of their strategy. We haven't really had a framework for that. It's really just been based on opinion. And several years back in one of the books that I've written, this is an outdated list at this point. You could definitely add a lot more to it, but just trying to classify different types of retirement income strategies. And there's so many out there. And so this is just an example of, we really don't have any universal framework or guidance about how to approach retirement. And so different individuals have come up with different strategies, whether they're decision rules about how to have variable spending from investments, whether they're approaches that try to build a lifetime income floor. Just there's been a lot of different ideas out there about how to build a retirement strategy. Now, this is where trying to help people then have an approach to manage this, we want to get at this idea of what is someone's retirement style? Like, what are their preferences and how can they understand their preferences to help guide them towards choosing from among these strategies? We want to match those preferences to a method for actually sourcing. And this is an important point there, essential, kind of the essential versus discretionary. The essential spending is really what these retirement styles are about. How do you want to source essential spending needs for retirement? And then at that point, aligning discretionary goals as well with an investment portfolio. But it can be hard to do that before you, or until after you've first identified how do you want to fund the essentials. For some people, it will just be having a total return investing strategy. For other people, they may want to approach investing differently for essentials versus for discretionary. Okay, so we've known this for a while. Harry Markowitz developed modern portfolio theory in the 1950s. It's the idea of asset allocation and diversification and the efficient frontier. He won the Nobel Prize for that in 1990. And then in 1991, in the very first issue of Financial Services Review, he was asked to write a commentary on how does modern portfolio theory apply to households. And he said he never considered it before. And after thinking about it for an evening, he recognized modern portfolio theory was never meant for a household investor. It was designed for large institutions like mutual fund companies that are infinitely lived, that don't have any liability they're trying to fund. It really is an assets only portfolio diversification type of question that they face. Households face a different set of considerations. And so he's saying you really have to approach this differently. I view this article as the birth of retirement income planning, as something distinct within the broader realm of financial planning. And we've had retirement planning, but retirement planning was often focused on the pre-retirement accumulation, whether to use different tax advantaged accounts in our tax code and so forth. Retirement income starts with the process of how do you then take the distributions to fund expenses after leaving the workforce. So we know I showed 37 different strategies before. Those can be summarized into how the Financial Planning Association has presented this. Now I'll rename some of these, but it's the basic idea. Systematic withdrawals, that's what I'll call total returns. That's systematically spending from an investment portfolio. Essential versus discretionary, that's also been called floor versus upside, or it's really about building a lifetime income floor for the essentials and then investing on top of that for discretionary expenses. And I'll break that one into two categories, the income protection and risk wrap, as two different ways to approach that. I'll get into more detail. And then time segmentation, which has always been presented as a hybrid approach between systematic withdrawals and essential versus discretionary. And that's where you invest differently for different time horizons with the idea, it's also known as bucketing. You use some sort of safer, like less volatile fixed income asset to cover shorter term expenses. And then you have the growth portfolio, investing for upside and so forth for the more discretionary types of expenses. Not discretionary, for the longer term, after the short term buckets, you have these assets earmarked more for longer term expenses. Okay, so we have these four different retirement income strategies that, again, the total return, that's systematic withdrawals. You've got the income protection, which is one of the flooring approaches. You've got the time segmentation, which is going to be the bucketing type approach. And then risk wrap, which is Well, the distinction is income protection generally is more about using simple income annuities, single premium immediate annuities, deferred income annuities, QLACs, longevity insurance, sometimes fixed index annuities with living benefits that have that principal protection for the underlying asset value. And then risk wrap is more the world of like the deferred annuity, like the variable annuity, now the registered index linked annuity, where there is downside risk for the underlying asset, but also greater upside potential, and still a protected lifetime income through the living benefits that these types of annuities can offer. Okay, so we're back to this question again. How do retirees choose from amongst the different retirement strategy possibilities? And so the answer has been many different possibilities, whether it's they've listened to a financial advisor's radio show, they've read a personal finance blog, they follow the personal finance consumer media like Kiplinger, which is really the only print edition left, but there used to be many others like Money Magazine, Smart Money, and so forth. They attend some sort of local advisor seminar, attend a local class, maybe at the community college or the library, some sort of community education, retirement planning class. Work with a financial advisor, of course, is another option, but it's more, they're finding some sort of resource that's telling them, here's the way to build a retirement income plan. And usually that guidance will come in the form of whatever solution that individual, the speaker has in mind, that's presented to the consumer as this is the right way to do things. And then, well, the question is, was a proper match made? Does the style of the consumer in that situation match the style of the individual providing that guidance? And so that's really been all we had. And so a lot of times, based on different business models within financial services and so forth, if you generally are either licensed or your business model uses one type of strategy or one type of solution, you try to fit that to everyone. And that's that old analogy of if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And so that then leads to many different proposed way of doing things, again, without necessarily any sort of validation beyond, here's what I think is the right way to do things. Any other strategy is wrong because they're conflicted with their advice or whatever the case may be. But again, it's really just, there hasn't been a lot of analytical guidance behind choosing a retirement strategy. So this is an aside to all this as well, because when we talk about these retirement income styles, an incorrect way to frame it would be, this is a risk tolerance questionnaire for retirement. And that's not the case. It's the retirement income styles is more about finding a retirement personality, but that it's an important aside that we have risk tolerance questionnaires and they're used pre-retirement to help. It's really a tool of modern portfolio theory with the idea, build a diversified portfolio, invest as aggressively as possible because we believe in the risk premium from the stock market to provide a bigger long-term return. However, subject to the ability of that individual to stomach short-term market volatility, so they can only invest as aggressively as their risk tolerance allows them with regard to short-term market volatility. So that is a tool we've had pre-retirement. And that's a tool that gets used post-retirement, but it's not necessarily effective post-retirement. I mean, and there's a lot of issues with risk tolerance questionnaires, such as, do they measure like the underlying state of, if markets are down, do people score as more risk averse? If markets were up, do they score as more risk tolerant and so forth? There's a lot of issues like that we can set aside entirely and just, we can accept the risk tolerance questionnaire on face value as not having these issues. However, it still has this other important issue, which is, does it really speak to the concerns people have for retirement? So risk tolerance questionnaires were just born out of like this necessity for financial service firms to have a way to offer an asset allocation guidance, a model portfolio, and to justify that they're doing it in a way that's suitable for the client. So that's fine, but then post-retirement, well, we can also argue that pre-retirement, maybe this idea of short-term market volatility measures risk, that's questionable, but post-retirement, there is much more question about, does this risk metric of the risk tolerance questionnaire, which is short-term market volatility, does that actually speak to the concerns people have for retirement? And the answer is no, people have other concerns. There isn't just one concern. People are worried about outliving their wealth. People are worried about having, and this was something like having reserves for unexpected spending. But what we've also found in doing this survey research is reserves can really be split two ways. People have distinct concerns about having reserves for healthcare and long-term care spending needs, and then having reserves for other spending shocks, such as having to replace a roof or whatever the case may be, something else where you suddenly have a big bill and you need to have some liquidity to cover that expense. So people are concerned about these things. Now, people may be concerned about overall maximizing lifestyle as well, and that's where the risk tolerance questionnaire does potentially speak to that, but not necessarily for these other concerns. And I'll talk more about that. But so retirement is different. We do need to consider that these more multidimensional aspects of risk that just are not going to be included in a risk tolerance questionnaire. And so we want to find some sort of method to help understand. Again, it's as a first step in retirement planning, what kind of approach, what kind of style, which leads to an approach to build your retirement plan. Okay, so what do people worry about for retirement? Again, they may worry about outliving, and this people may judge these differently. So outliving your assets, the sequence of returns risk, where a market downturn digs a hole for your portfolio that's harder to recover from when you're actually spending from the assets, different types of spending shocks, declining cognitive abilities, compounding inflation, and so on and so on. I talk about these 4 L's, and I always talk about these before as the 4 goals of financial goals of retirement, but they also can just be explained as the concerns people have for retirement. So longevity, outliving your, not wanting to outlive the ability to meet your essential spending in retirement. Lifestyle, maximizing your overall lifestyle to get the most enjoyment out of retirement. Legacy, which we find really isn't that important to most people. Legacy is about leaving something for the next generation, but it's frequently framed as, okay, if there's something left over, that's fine, the next generation can have it. Otherwise, it's not necessarily a high priority concern for many people. And then liquidity, having reserves available for unexpected expenses that weren't budgeted in as part of longevity and lifestyle. And then really there's 5 L's in that regard, because liquidity is both for spending shocks other than health and long-term care. And then we could say like long-term care liquidity or reserves for long-term care expenses as a 5th L. Okay, so it can be hard, again, to match up your style here. That's where, so this research was published in the journal of, the Retirement Management Journal. The article is selecting a personalized retirement income strategy. And this journal is freely available on the internet if anyone would like to look that up and read the full research article. But what we come down to is we're trying to understand what guides people's decisions about retirement. And so just in reading different books for consumers, for financial advisors, and so forth, trying to understand what are distinct ideas where people have to make some sort of judgment call, that they have to make a choice or face some sort of trade-off, and then try to identify what those possibilities are. And then we do an exploratory factor analysis to then try to understand which factors actually seem to be important. And so what you see here is based on a full statistical algorithm that is leading us to these conclusions that there's these 2 primary factors that have a distinct role in really helping to explain somebody's preferences about retirement, and then also 4 secondary factors. So I'll talk about what these mean, because the really neat thing is how your views on these different ideas translate into these retirement strategies that we have. So really what we're doing here is you give someone a questionnaire, you see their scoring on these 6 different factors, and you don't necessarily even need all 6. It's really the first 2 that you see there that are the most important. But then you translate that into, okay, here's the retirement strategy that seems to best align with what you said are your preferences for retirement, whether that's total return, risk wrap, income protection, or time segmentation. Okay, so then this is really what we're doing here is, like, this is how I view the broader process of retirement income planning. The goals are the 4 L's on the left. They map into liabilities or expenses associated with those goals on the right. And then just how do you position assets to fund these goals or to fund these liabilities between reliable income assets that have some sort of contractual element behind them, the diversified portfolio that'll focus more on a risk premium, and then reserve assets that are not otherwise earmarked for another goal that are available for the unexpected. And depending on your style, you have different ways to build that retirement income, that reliable income piece for the essentials. If you're a total return investor, you specifically are willing to use your diversified portfolio to fund an essential expense. Okay, so now these factors, probability-based versus safety first and optionality versus commitment, those are the 2 primary factors. And so probability-based is, how do you like to draw your retirement income? And this is all based on the semantic differential. My co-author is a psychologist, so he brings in the that terminology and jargon, but you can't choose right in the middle. You answer a series of questions. This is just how these questions look, but you can't be right in the middle. You have to pick one side or the other, but you circle one of the 6 circles there that best meets, are you strongly probability-based, strongly safety first, or somewhere in between? If you're probability-based, you're comfortable depending on market growth through the risk premium from risky assets such as stocks, and the idea that these risky assets will outperform bonds, and so you can fund your retirement that way. You can spend more than a bond portfolio would allow because you're comfortable depending on the risk premium to arrive and to support a higher level of spending. Versus if you're safety first, you don't have that comfort in the same way with risky assets. You'd really prefer some sort of contractual protection to provide relative safety. Now, nothing is truly 100% safe, but at least relative to unknown market outcomes. Having a contract in place implies a degree of safety that you can't get through the risk premium. Now, that could just be with individual bonds, or you can use risk pooling through an annuity as a way to also fund more than bonds can support. And so ultimately it's probability-based versus safety first is really, are you more comfortable with the risk premium from the stock market or with risk premium from annuities? Or again, what may be a more hybrid approach, just holding individual bonds to maturity, which doesn't give you any premium, but it will allow you to perhaps feel more comfortable having your other assets invested aggressively for the risk premium. And then the second primary factor, I never really would have guessed the data would show that this would have been the important factor, but that's what the data shows. And it's this idea of optionality versus commitment. Now, of course, everyone likes options, but when it comes to defining a plan to cover your essential spending, how much does the optionality matter to you? Do you really want that flexibility to keep your options open, to take advantage of new opportunities? And if so, then you have more than optionality preference versus if you have a commitment orientation, you really prefer to lock in a solution that you know will solve for your lifetime income need. It may limit your ability to make changes in the future, but you don't necessarily feel a need for that. And maybe you feel more comfortable being able to check this off your to-do list so you don't have to be as worried about it on an ongoing basis. If you found a solution that will work to solve the problem you have, are you comfortable committing to that or not? And that's really the nuance about if you have more of an optionality orientation or more of a commitment orientation. And so back to that idea of, does a risk tolerance questionnaire explain these things? And how do these retirement factors explain these things? So what we can see is the risk tolerance questionnaires are based on this idea of loss aversion. Like, how do you view a gain against a potential loss based on your starting point? And that sort of risk tolerance loss aversion, that can help to explain lifestyle concerns. So that people who are worried about maximizing their overall lifestyle, it makes sense. They're more willing to focus on maximizing risk-adjusted returns. And if they're more risk tolerance, there's a positive relationship to more concern about maximizing their lifestyle. But that's the only concern that a risk tolerance questionnaire helps to explain. However, these retirement income factors, they can explain other concerns. So with longevity concerns, that's the risk of outliving your assets and not being able to fund your essential expenses throughout retirement. That links up with an optionality commitment orientation, where the more of a commitment orientation you have, the more you tend to be concerned about longevity. And so you can explain people's longevity concerns with that retirement income factor. Likewise with reserves. Those who are more concerned about making sure they have reserves not earmarked for other uses that are available for spending shocks, we tend to see and explain that if they have more of a safety first orientation, that can help to explain people's attitudes towards reserves and towards how they feel about the risk of not having reserves. With the lifestyle, that is actually also explained well with optionality is the answer there. That if you have more of an optionality orientation, then that expresses you have more lifestyle concerns. And that relationship is actually much stronger than the loss aversion relationship. And then also legacy can be explained, whereas those who have more of an optionality orientation, though in general, people are less concerned about legacy, but we can at least explain when people have more of a legacy concern, it's usually they have more of an optionality orientation as well. And so we can understand, we now have factors that can help explain all four of these multidimensional retirement concerns, unlike the loss of risk tolerance questionnaire that can really, at the end of the day, only explain a lifestyle concern. Okay, so then those two primary factors, we can build a matrix out of that. And so this is a retirement income style awareness matrix. Where does an individual fall in the spectrum between safety first and probability based horizontally? And then vertically, where do they fall in the spectrum between commitment orientation and optionality orientation? And that leads to 4 quadrants as the 4 different combinations of these. And so we'll stick a pin in that for a moment. I'll come back to that, but let me mention the secondary factors as well. Okay, so secondary factors, they're not essential to the story, but they do help to tell the story. And so if some prospect's not very patient of wanting to go through the whole list of questions for all 6 factors, they can just do the 2 primary factors. But with secondary factors, this is what they are. How do you view building an income floor for reliable income needs? Do you have more of a time-based preference for that? So you kind of segment over time, like it's kind of like as you go along, you keep building out the track in front of you. So the next few years, time-based reliable income floors, or do you really have a preference for a perpetual income floor, which would mean having an income floor from the outset that provides a solution over the lifetime basis? How do you view your reserve assets? Do you have a true liquidity mindset or a technical liquidity mindset? So for those with a true liquidity mindset, they want to specifically be able to say, for something to be a reserve, it's not earmarked for another use. It has to be available. Like if I believe in the 4% rule and I have $1 million portfolio and I want to spend $40,000, well, that $1 million, if it's in a brokerage account, technically it's liquid, which we'll get to on the right there, but in a meaningful sense of retirement, that $1 million is earmarked to meet the future $40,000 spending goal. And so if you have a true liquidity mindset, you're not going to view that $1 million as liquid. You need assets above and beyond that to be available for the unexpected, because if you use that $1 million for the unexpected, it's no longer available to cover your future $40,000 lifetime spending goal. Versus if you have a technical liquidity mindset, you really don't make that type of distinction. You're willing to just, okay, I've got this pot of assets. Of course, there's all these different types of risks, but I don't necessarily need to have reserves to cover each of them. I just have a pot of assets and hopefully things will balance out. Like if I do get hit by a big spending shock, hopefully I'm not also going to get hit by a bad sequence of market returns. And so I'll just draw from the same general pot of assets to be able to fund my expenses, well, to fund my needs throughout retirement. The next one, probably I would have guessed would have been one of the primary factors, but really at the end of the day, it can be explained. It's still distinct, but it's not a primary factor because a lot of what it tells us can be explained instead by probability-based safety first and optionality commitment. But this is just, what's your mindset about retirement investing? If you have an accumulation mindset, You're really just maintaining the same sort of pre-retirement accumulation focus on maximizing risk-adjusted returns, emphasizing portfolio growth, not being worried about funding a predictable income stream. Whereas if you have a distribution mindset, you're less worried about maximizing returns, getting the highest possible portfolio value. Your emphasis is more on having a predictable income stream. And if that means less growth potentially, that's okay, because your retirement is focused more on how can I fund my lifestyle or my longevity, not how can I just grow the pot of assets. So do you keep the same pre-retirement accumulation mindset, or do you transition into a distribution mindset? And for all of these, there's no right answer. This is really about, these are options people have. How do their preferences align with one of the two options? And then finally, front loading versus back loading. So this gets at the sense of, if you're a front loader, you kind of focus more on the present. You want to make sure, okay, I know I'm alive and healthy today. Let's make sure I fully enjoy my retirement, because we don't know what the future will bring. There may not be a tomorrow. Let's get the most satisfaction out of today. Whereas if you have a backloading preference, this is also called longevity risk aversion. This is the concern about outliving assets. And it reflects, you're willing to not necessarily sacrifice too much today, but you're willing to spend less today to be able to better protect your future lifestyle. That you can't imagine a scenario where you're in your 90s and don't have any money left. Versus with a front loading preference, you're just not as worried about that type of scenario. The bigger concern you have is that you regret you could have spent more in your 60s because you ended up not making it to your 90s. That's more of your focus, versus the backloading is, no, I don't want to be in a position where I'm in my 90s and don't have assets other than Social Security, for example. Okay, so those secondary factors, there's correlations here amongst all of these things. If you're probability based with the market growth, that tends to correlate with being optionality oriented. If you're safety first with that contractual protection, that tends to correlate with a commitment orientation. And so that's that diagonal arrow between the upper right and the bottom left. That reflects natural correlations, that these do become the two more primary strategies or quadrants. And then the secondary factors align with that. So if you're in the upper right, and maybe let me go ahead and go to the next slide, because this is where the strategies come into play. So if you're in the upper right-hand quadrant, academics like to talk about the annuity puzzle, which is why don't people use annuities more? But you can kind of see in the upper right-hand quadrant, all these preferences point to not seeing a value for annuities. You emphasize optionality, you're comfortable relying on market growth, you have an accumulation mindset, you're not worried about predictable income, and you're time-based flooring, you're not worried about having that perpetual income floor. Your preferences just don't speak to using an annuity. You want a total return investing strategy, the kind of well-diversified, aggressive type investment portfolio that will emphasize risk premium, and that's how you approach retirement. Versus if you're on the lower left, this is going to be the other core strategy. This is income protection. This is, I want contractual protections to fund my essential spending needs. I am comfortable committing to a solution that I know will solve for my lifetime problem. I have a distribution mindset, so I'm more focused on predictable income in retirement. I have the true liquidity mindset, which means I worry less that a SPIA may not be liquid, and focus more on how that SPIA might meet a spending need with less assets than an investment portfolio using a safe withdrawal rate where I don't know really what that safe withdrawal rate is. I do have a perpetual income floor, and I do have that backloading preference. I'm worried about outliving my assets. I want to better protect my future self. So that's income protection. And then the other two strategies, this was the really neat thing as this developed, was seeing how both time segmentation and risk wrap were always explained as behavioral strategies that may not have been rational, but that clients can use to better meet their irrationality to make it their way through retirement. And we see that because it has inconsistent, or at least it has preferences that are not, the natural correlations aren't there. So if you're in time segmentation, your safety first, you want contractual protections, but you also have an optionality mindset. And so there's a bit of a conflict there. How can I have a contract that protects me if I also want to keep my options open? Well, financial professionals came up with an answer. It's use individual bonds to provide contractual protections over the short term in retirement, and then get your optionality from a growth portfolio that's earmarked more to cover longer term expenses. And that might help you get through some of the market volatility, because if you can say to yourself, I know I have my expenses covered for X number of years, if there's a stock market downturn, I can just kind of take comfort in, I'm pretty sure the market is going to recover before I need to spend from it. Now, this is that there's still, whenever you talk about using the risk premium from the stock market, there is some sort of time diversification or belief in stocks for the long run. And it's just more palatable to do that if you have a contractually protected front-end income floor. And then risk wrap as well, it's kind of behavioral. It's people don't necessarily like income annuities because they're not liquid, because they don't have upside potential. And so the insurance world has developed the deferred annuities with living benefits as an alternative there of, okay, with one financial product, you can build an income floor, but still have technical liquidity for the contract, as well as upside investing potential, because you believe in probability-based market growth, but also downside protection, because even though you're comfortable with market growth, you do have these other considerations. You are comfortable committing to a strategy, and you really are worried about outliving your money. So you don't necessarily want to be fully dependent on the stock market. And that's where a risk wrap strategy, which lets you invest in the market, but still puts a downside floor on how bad things might get for you, can be very attractive. And so that's kind of a behavioral explanation of how these types of annuity products were developed, or why they were developed in the first place. Now, when we did this, first we did it with readers at my website, theretirementresearcher.com, which are not representative of the US population, but we have subsequently rerun the study with a nationally representative sample of 3,000 Americans, not just the like engineers who treat retirement planning as a personal hobby, but a cross section of the American public. And these numbers held up in the national surveys as well, that about a third of the population, 35% of people, they are in that total return quadrant. About a third of the population is in that income protection quadrant. And then about 15% are in each of the time segmentation in risk wrap. And the reason it's not like equally divided is just because of there's a natural correlation that optionality tends to correlate with probability-based. Safety first tends to correlate with commitment. And so you do see more people showing up in those two quadrants, but you still see reflections in the other two quadrants as well. As this is, again, because we've now done this not just at Retirement Researcher, but with a nationally representative sample of 3,000 Americans. This is really, it seems like this is how the American public, the retirement income styles, do seem to be distributed. And so a lot of the consumer media says use a total return strategy if it's talking about Bill Bengen's 4% rule or whatever else the case may be. And ultimately, maybe it's only about a third of the population where that will really resonate as the best way forward for retirement. But for the other 65% of the population, they're looking for something beyond just a diversified investment portfolio, whether it's a bond ladder front-end income floor, whether it's some sort of annuity offering a lifetime income protection. They're looking for something beyond just the investment strategy. And so these next couple of slides just sort of summarize that, and I can really just skip these. I've explained this all already. And then so when we think about like solutions of how do you then use different financial tools, well, there's a role for investments in any of the quadrants, but it's just what role do they play? In the upper right with total returns, the multi-asset class diversified investment portfolio, that's the whole story. That's what you use to cover all retirement spending beyond what you naturally have through, say, Social Security or a company pension and so forth. With the other quadrants, well, on the bottom half, this is both flooring type approaches. So you decide how you want to build that perpetual income floor, and then you invest for lifestyle expenses above and beyond that. And then the upper left-hand quadrant with time segmentation, you're positioning bonds to cover short-term expenses, you're positioning stocks to cover longer-term expenses. And so you don't have, like if you have a 60-40 portfolio in the total return world, that means just you have a constant duration bond fund, 40% of assets, some sort of stock funds, 60% of assets. In time segmentation, if you have a 60-40 portfolio, it's, I took 40% of my assets to build an income floor to cover my spending for the next 8 or 10 years. And then the other 60% of my assets, I'm putting in the growth portfolio to seek growth and risk premium for longer term spending needs. And then how do annuities fit into all that? Well, it's really a matter of, if you're in the top half, you're probably not going to be very interested in annuities, except in some limited cases, never for lifetime income necessarily. But if you're in the upper right, there's these new structured annuities, the registered index-linked annuities that cut off some of the downside risk, also cut off some of the upside potential, but maybe has some interest to a total return investor to get a more structured return rather than having a full bell-shaped curve around the distributions, and otherwise investment-only variable annuities for just tax deferral, if a low-cost tax deferral solution. If you're in the upper left in time segmentation, it's just a matter of, are there annuity alternatives that can replace the fixed income piece, whether it's a period certain income annuity, whether it's the MYGA, the multi-year guaranteed annuity is kind of the CD ladder equivalent in the annuity world, or whether a fixed index annuity just for accumulation. Then if you're in the bottom half, that's where you may look for a lifetime income type flooring approach. And the more safety first you are, the more you're willing to look at a simple SPIA or a DIA, the annuitized contract that exchanges a premium for an income for life. Fixed index annuities can also fit into that income protection world with the living benefits, especially if the payout on those living benefits is competitive, because if it has a similar downside risk, worst case scenario income payout, you might look for that as the alternative while still getting principal protection plus the technical liquidity for the asset. And then on the lower right in the risk wrap, that's where you are willing to have the underlying sub-account or the underlying investment have volatility, have exposure to loss, but by accepting exposure to loss, also having more upside potential, but then layering in a living benefit that's like a put option on the stock market, where even if stocks go down, you know that spending is protected over the lifetime. So you have something you can invest for upside. You don't get the full upside, but because you have a put option where if markets do poorly, you'll get this payout from the living benefit to support a lifetime spending need. So for takeaways from all this, any of these approaches are viable. That's ultimately, I'm agnostic. There's different ways you can build a retirement income plan. A lot of people advocate for one or the other. And ultimately, I don't think there is just one right way to approach retirement. I think all four of those styles are viable. It's not mathematically, one's not better than the other. They have equivalent kind of potential depending on how exactly you implement them. And the right approach for someone then really just depends on what is their personal style, what's going to resonate best with them, what will help them stick to a strategy that they're comfortable with, be able to sleep and be able to get the most satisfactory retirement outcomes. So these RISA factors help to identify starting points for that conversation. And by no means would suggest if you scored your income protection, you have to buy the annuity or something like that. But it's a starting point for the conversation. Maybe you don't even need, because maybe Social Security and a pension more than cover your longevity expenses. So then you can say, okay, I'm income protection, but it turns out maybe because I'm income protection, I had a job that has a big pension as part of it. That's my reliable lifetime income already. But at least it helps people to have a starting point for talking about a retirement strategy that should resonate. And so I do think advisors should understand, what is your personal style as an advisor? How does that impact your advice? And how does that impact the offerings of your firm? And increasingly, there's different solutions to all this. If an advisory firm really wants to focus on doing the best it can to be number one at serving a particular style, well, then helping to identify the type of clientele who will best be served by that particular style. Or the other alternative is, we see increasingly firms are expanding the business model to incorporate being able to provide solutions for any of the four styles. And that can be a different way to structure the business, to offer both investment and insurance type products as part of what the firm is able to provide. And whether that's like taking the fee only route, but having solutions that meet the fee only criteria, or whether that's opening up to be fees and commissions. There's a lot of different ways to structure all that, but it's important to start thinking in terms of that, in terms of how do I want to structure the advisory business? What type of solutions do I want to provide? What type of clientele should I focus on that will be best served by the solutions I am able to provide? And to not necessarily continue to think that one style is best for everyone, because it's increasingly going to be difficult to justify that. So let me go ahead and stop there. And Dr. Chen, if we want to open up the floor, if there are any
Yes.
questions.
So if you have, thank you, Dr. Pfau. This is extremely insightful. So I don't know if there's any questions. If you do, you can put that in the chat box. And Dr. Pfau, I do have like two questions. One is, if someone would like to take the assessment that you go through, are they using the link that you have there, /advisor, the last URL on the screen? Is that the correct one?
Yeah, that can be one way. So that link actually on here, at the end of April, we'll have a couple-day long advisor challenge. And as part of that, yes, you can take the RISA as part of that. It's just a free opportunity to learn more about the RISA and take it and so forth. Otherwise, there is a link on page 15 of my retirement planning guidebook that you can also, if you're just interested to take the RISA, can use that link too. And that's the risaprofile.com/ and then guidebook instead of advisor, to just take.
Can I put that on the chat box? Is that?
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay. Yeah, so that will be the link for those of you interested to get yourself assessed. I assessed myself as well, and finally realized that my style is so different compared to others, and I need to understand the biases before I push that out to the clients. The second questions that I have was, so for those company that have limitation of selling annuities. For example, recently I ran into an advisor who's trying to manage my money, and he told me specifically, I cannot buy any more annuities because their company has this sort of pseudo percentage limit for liquid percentage of your assets that cannot be invested in annuities. So what would you recommend in that case for advisors in that situation? The clients, me, want annuity.
Yeah, that's maybe a different than the more general problem, but right, a lot of firms may just have some sort of limitation that you can't have more than 40% of assets go into the annuity. Like if you have an advisor who's been happy to work with you, but they run into that sort of limitation, I guess at this point, you kind of have to take some of those funds externally.
That's true.
The bigger issue is just a lot of firms may not even be willing to talk about annuities. And increasingly though, the concern before was if you're a fee-only advisor, most annuities were paid a commission and that didn't fit into your business model. Right. But there are fee-only annuity options. So advisors who are fee-only can still offer annuities, or otherwise just, if it's the best interest of the client, you have to take the hit on assets under management and like refer that business out to someone who could provide the annuity.
Right. I think that for me, a number of years ago, I actually did that for one client. I have to refer her out because at that time, many, many years ago, that the firm that I was affiliated with had those limit as well. I don't see any questions coming through in the chat box. May I share my screen so that I could go to the closing part? Okay, hang on one second. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Pfau. This is extremely, okay, I just want to make sure I have the material there. Thank you so much for sharing your wonderful research. Let me stop one moment and share one more time. Something is not right. Okay. We are very glad to have you for the Next Gen Mentoring Forum session. Incredible insights, and I will encourage everyone, if you have a chance, to get his copy of the book. I have them in Kindle, and I know many people prefer still to read the paper format, but I definitely would encourage you to do that. And I also wanted to thank California Lutheran University School of Management Financial Planning Program for sponsoring today's Next Gen Mentoring Forum. California Lutheran University School of Management offers MBA in financial planning, helps financial advisors pursue a leadership position or grow their financial planning practice by deploying advanced financial planning, effective client communication, and to streamline your practice management. If you or someone that you know that potentially will be a good fit for this program, please refer them to join our next info session, and that will happen on February the 24th at 3 p.m. And thank you all for attending. We really do appreciate it. And thank you, Dr. Pfau, for today's presentation. Be safe and be well. We do have one questions, actually a comment, reading the latest book. So thank you, John, for that. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you in the next time. Thank you, Dr. Pfau.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.